When the prequel trilogy was first released, its portrayal of Anakin Skywalker was one of its most controversial elements, with many older fans unable to reconcile the prequel's depiction of Anakin with the original trilogy's depiction of Darth Vader. Even though popular opinion of prequel Anakin has softened, many still struggle to reconcile Anakin and Vader, so much so that they consider the hero of the Clone Wars and the Black Armored Sith Lord to be separate personalities. But as dissimilar as they may seem, Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader were indeed the same person. The character of Anakin Skywalker was complex and tortured, at once a valiant hero and a heartless murderer, incapable of fitting almost any character archetype. Today, in our first long-form video, hopefully among many more, we'll be giving Anakin's character the attention it deserves as we work out an answer to two deceptively simple questions. Who was Anakin Skywalker, and what made him tick?
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we begin, we've got a quick reading recommendation for you. In this video, we'll be quoting a lot from Matthew Stover's novelization of Revenge of the Sith, which we'll be referring to as the novelization hereafter. If you like Star Wars content and have a few dollars to spare, please go buy the novelization once this video is over. We can't stress enough how fantastic it is. It's better than the film. Hell, it's better than all of the films, and it will give you a new perspective on Star Wars and the characters of the prequel trilogy. With that out of the way, let's begin. There were many ways to describe Anakin Skywalker. He was brave, arrogant, cunning, quick to anger but deeply compassionate, and flippant but deeply concerned with what others thought of him. But we're going to start off with how the galactic public described him, as the hero with no fear. It was the HoloNet News that assigned him this nickname during the Clone Wars, and it was a fairly surface level summation of Anakin's bravery and audacity in combat. To the general public, Anakin Skywalker was the greatest of Jedi. He was a warrior who could and would defeat entire armies single-handedly, a fighter pilot with an unprecedentedly long list of confirmed kills, and a commander whose battle strategies strode the line between genius and insanity. The galaxy looked at what Anakin Skywalker did and could only conclude that he was completely fearless. Of course, in those days, Anakin was also seen as a hero. He was a constant champion of the Republic and its professed values. Those who knew him personally saw him as a deeply compassionate man, hell-bent on saving the day whenever he could. Then there's Darth Vader. Vader was fear itself, a terrifying presence that few dared to defy. He was totally devoid of compassion and humanity, an utterly ruthless being who cared little for the lives of those around him. Few would guess that he had once been Anakin Skywalker, the hero with no fear. But Skywalker's heroism and Vader's ruthlessness ultimately came from the same place. What some see as different personalities were, in reality, different aspects of the same core essence, a collection of values, attitudes, and personality traits that Anakin held from childhood to death. The development of these traits, naturally, began on Tatooine. The fact that Anakin Skywalker started life as a slave doesn't get nearly enough attention during discussions about his personality. During the formative years of his life, Anakin was treated as property, as subhuman by everyone except his mother and a handful of friends, of whom most were also slaves. He was owned first by the ruthless Garjula the Hutt, and then by Watto, and he suffered abuse under both masters. That sort of thing sticks with people for life. Anakin's enslaved years had profound influences on his personality, though they were often subtle and easy to miss. By the Battle of Coruscant, Anakin was 13 years removed from slavehood, and in the films, it might even seem like he's put his life on Tatooine behind him. But a quick line from the novelization, which details a sequence in which Anakin uses trauma from his past as a weapon against Count Dooku, tells a different story. When Count Dooku flies at him, blade flashing, Watto's fist cracks out from Anakin's childhood to knock the Sith Lord tumbling back. Anakin left Tatooine with plenty of scars, most of them psychological. Firstly, his experiences there had a profound impact on how Anakin saw himself. As a slave, Anakin wasn't seen as a person, and he was deeply conscious of this.
I'm a person, and my name is Anakin.
It didn't help that, upon joining the Jedi, Anakin suddenly went from being seen as property to being seen as the chosen one. Suddenly, he found himself surrounded by powerful Jedi who saw him as a being of prophecy. Now, Anakin was given respect, but he could also sense that many Jedi Masters didn't trust him. Some of those who believed he was the chosen one treated him like a ticking time bomb. His own master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, was among them. Obi-Wan was never confident in his ability to train Anakin, which Anakin sensed and interpreted as a personal failure. This gave Anakin some serious self-esteem issues. He was very arrogant and overconfident in his abilities. He was powerful and he knew it. But at the same time, he was very self-conscious, and how he believed others felt about him had an outsized effect on how he viewed himself. This was one of the reasons he grew so close with Palpatine as a Padawan. The Supreme Chancellor showered him with positive affirmation, which the Jedi rarely did. In addition, slavery left Anakin with a pivotal character trait: his fear of losing others. Anakin and his mother stuck together during their time enslaved, but a great many enslaved families weren't so lucky. The children of slaves were often taken from their mothers and sold, or the other way around. Anakin's childhood on Tatooine was overshadowed by the ever-present threat that Watto would sell his mother, something that Watto occasionally threatened to do when his profits were on the decline. As a slave, all Anakin really had in life was his mother, whom he grew fiercely attached to. The thought of being separated from her terrified him. Of course, Anakin ended up leaving his mother anyway, one of the hardest decisions he ever made. That act haunted him for the next decade, so much so that, during his time as a Padawan at the Jedi Temple, he avoided making friends, not wanting to suffer loss ever again. It didn't help that the next time he saw his mother, she died in his arms. This only intensified what was, by that point, a defining part of his character: his stark refusal to lose the people he cared about. We'll talk more about that in a bit. All of this brought a real intensity to Anakin's relationships. Due to his experiences growing up, Anakin had serious attachment issues. When he started to care about someone, he got really protective of them, as much as had been with his mother as a child. The people Anakin were close with were all he really had in life and all he really cared about. They were also the source of his self-worth. He built his world around his mother, Obi-Wan, Padme, and Palpatine. Beyond the small circle of the people who meant everything to him, nothing else mattered. Nothing else even made sense to him. To quote the novelization, Yoda and Mace exchanged glances, both thoughtfully grim. Obi-Wan guessed they were remembering the times Anakin had violated orders, the times he had put at risk entire operations, the lives of thousands, the control of whole planetary systems, to save a friend. More than once, in fact, to save Obi-Wan. I think, Obi-Wan said carefully, that abstractions like peace don't mean much to him. He's loyal to people, not to principles, and he expects loyalty in return. He'll stop at nothing to save me, for example, because he thinks I would do the same for him. Mace and Yoda gazed at him steadily, and Obi-Wan had to lower his head, because, he admitted reluctantly, he knows I would do the same for him. Anakin's worldview was extremely simplistic. He stood by the people he cared about and would do anything to protect them. That was really the extent of his motivations. He theoretically believed in things like peace and justice as well, but those sorts of concepts didn't really register with him. To Anakin, all things like peace and justice meant were the people he cared about being treated well, and viewed any threat to his loved ones as unequivocally evil, which was an incredibly black and white approach to morality. To him, there was only good and evil, nothing in between. Even as Jedi, Anakin hated those he saw as evil, those he saw as the enemy. Anything that threatened those he cared about enraged him, often driving him to commit acts of brutality unbecoming of a Jedi. He was always perfectly willing to kill or torture anyone who threatened his friends. To him, they were evil, and that meant they deserved everything he did to them. This aspect of his worldview was what drove him to massacre the Sand People, to torture Poggle the Lesser and other separatists during the Clone Wars, and ultimately to butcher younglings in the Jedi Temple. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there. As is usually the case, the anger and hate Anakin felt toward his enemies stemmed from fear. To quote the novelization, HoloNet features call him the hero with no fear. And why not? What should he be afraid of? Except, fear lives inside him anyway, chewing away the firewalls around his heart. Anakin sometimes thinks of the dread that eats at his heart as a dragon. Children on Tatooine tell each other of the dragons that live inside the suns. Smaller cousins of the sun dragons are supposed to live in the fusion furnaces that power everything from starships to pod racers. But Anakin's fear is another kind of dragon, a cold kind, a dead kind. Not long after he became Obi-Wan's Padawan all those years ago, a minor mission had brought them to a dead system, one so immeasurably old that its star had long ago turned to a frigid dwarf of hypercompacted trace metals. Anakin couldn't even remember what the mission might have been, but he'd never forgotten that dead star. It had scared him. Stars can die? It is the way of the universe, which is another manner of saying that it is the will of the Force, Obi-Wan had told him. Everything dies. In time, even stars burn out. This is why Jedi form no attachments. All things pass. That is the kind of fear that lives inside Anakin Skywalker, the dragon of that dead star. It's an ancient, cold, dead voice within his heart that whispers, all things die. The dragon reminds him every night that someday he will lose Obi-Wan, he will lose Padme, or they will lose him. All things die, Anakin Skywalker, even stars burn out. Anakin was never really afraid for his own life, but he was terrified about losing others. Obi-Wan, Padme, Palpatine, Ahsoka, Rex, and even R2 meant the world to him. He depended on his attachments to them for his sense of self, and everything he did for them. To lose any of them would be to lose a part of himself. This was what made Anakin push himself so hard, to endlessly yearn to be the best in everything. Part of it was trying to please the people he cared about, and part of it was a lack of self-esteem, but it was also because he wanted to be able to save everyone he loved. Especially after Shmi died, he became determined never to lose anyone else again. To return to the novelization, that's what makes him a real hero. Not the way the HoloNet labels him. Not without fear, but stronger than fear. He looks the dragon in the eye and doesn't even slow down. If anyone can save Palpatine, Anakin will, because he's already the best and he's still getting better. But locked away behind the walls of his heart, the dragon that is his fear coils and squirms and hisses. Because his real fear, in a universe where even stars can die, is that being the best will never quite be good enough. As Yoda predicted it would, Anakin's fear of loss led to anger, then hate, and eventually to suffering. What Anakin feared was inevitable, no matter what he did, but he could never bring himself to accept that. He could never come to terms even with the idea of his loved ones dying. This, as we all know, led him down the path to the dark side. You see, there was a reason the Jedi forbade emotional attachments, why they recruited only young children and raised them in a secluded temple. It was because attachments could lead to possession, seeing another person as yours. Anakin is the perfect example of this. Consider his relationship with Padme. He loved her, obviously, and he was extremely attached to her, more afraid to lose her than anyone else. When he began having visions of Padme's impending death, it terrified him so much that he refused to sleep and became hellbent on finding a way to save her. But what's often overlooked is that Padme didn't share his concerns at all. She didn't think she was going to die in childbirth, but she was perfectly willing to accept death if it came for her. Her acceptance, however, did nothing to affect Anakin's judgment. This was because he wasn't afraid of losing her for her sake, but for his own. That wasn't love, but selfishness. It's a common misconception that Jedi were forbidden to love. In Attack of the Clones, Anakin actually says the opposite.
Attachment is forbidden. Possession is forbidden. Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love, is central to a Jedi's life. So you might say that we are encouraged to love.
Note that, in the sense the Jedi would use it, attachment is just a synonym for possession. In more conventional use, we might deem any sort of shared love an emotional attachment, but the Jedi would not. For the Jedi, the difference between love and attachment was one of selflessness versus selfishness. Love was pure and accepted whatever was best for the other person, whereas attachment usually involved a refusal to let go of the other person. In the extreme, attachments led people to prioritize their wants above the other person's needs. For normal people, emotional attachments in the Jedi sense weren't inherently destructive, though obviously any possessive relationship is toxic. But Jedi weren't normal people. They were Force sensitives, and that meant they had to maintain constant vigilance against the dark side. The Jedi worked so hard to avoid attachments because they were the easiest path to the dark side. If you're not willing to let someone go, it's easy to let others suffer to save the people you care about. Anakin Skywalker was perhaps the best possible example of why this policy was so important. To quote the novelization, Anakin has no interest in serene acceptance of what the Force will bring. Not here, not now. Not with the lives of Palpatine and Obi-Wan at stake. It's just the opposite. He seizes upon the Force with the stark refusal to fail. He will land this ship. He will save his friends. Between his will and the will of the Force, there is no contest. In case you were wondering, this was what using the dark side was like. That was the real dichotomy between light and dark. Lightsiders surrendered to the will of the Force, accepting whatever was best for the universe, while Darksiders rejected it, pursuing their own selfish desires. Anakin did this a fair bit, even before falling to the dark side completely. Truth be told, Anakin was never really cut out to be a Jedi. He should have been sent to a therapist after the Battle of Naboo, not the Jedi Temple. But Fates had other plans, and while Anakin Skywalker walked the path of the Jedi, the dark side loomed over him. As a Padawan, Anakin did his best to stick to Jedi doctrine and avoid attachments. As we mentioned earlier, for the early years of his training, he tried to avoid making friends, in part for this reason. But attachment was something that, by that point, was hard-baked into his psychology. He ended up becoming attached to Obi-Wan and Palpatine, and he remained attached to his mother and Padme, even though they weren't really in his life anymore. When he and Padme reunited during the events of Attack of the Clones, Anakin's efforts to be a good Jedi fell apart. After the outbreak of the Clone Wars and his marriage to Padme, everything spiraled out of control. He gave up trying to control his attachments, and in doing so, he fed the dragon in his heart, to use the novelization's metaphor. The stronger his attachments grew, the more he feared for the people around him, and the more afraid he became, the more attached he grew. Over the course of the Clone Wars, this eternally escalating cycle started to unravel him. He drew increasingly on the dark side until, one day, he snapped. The dark side was addictive. It brought instant gratification, but of an empty sort that left the user wanting more. For Anakin, the dark side promised to save the ones he loved, whereas the light side meant simply accepting their deaths. The thing about saving someone, however, is that it's impermanent. You can save someone's life 1,000 times, they'll still eventually die. Because of this, it wasn't enough for Anakin to draw on the dark side once to save his loved ones. He would have to do it again and again. After he started having visions of Padme's death, he began craving more power so that he could save her life indefinitely. This was how the path to the dark side usually went. The details differed, but the pattern was the same. Jedi would reject the lessons of the light side and charge down an empty road to hell in a vain quest for increasingly greater power. Truth be told, Anakin could have won the battle with his dragon. Victory would have meant acceptance. At the end of the day, his fear was right. he would one day lose everyone. If he accepted that, if he had let go, it would have been hard, but it would have ultimately been the better path, as Yoda told him in Revenge of the Sith. In the moments, it would have destroyed Anakin on a fundamental level, but it was a wound he could have recovered from. Sometimes, when a broken bone heals improperly, you have to break it again to set it correctly. That wasn't the path Anakin took. Unfortunately for Anakin, Yoda wasn't the only one who offered him advice after he started envisioning Padme's death. Palpatine did as well, and this secret Sith Lord echoed the promises of the dark side. Palpatine offered an easier way, a quicker way, a means of attaining the power to keep Padme alive forever. In other words, Palpatine offered Anakin a lie, one Anakin believed. By that point, Anakin had all but fallen to the dark side, as he was desperate to save Padme and win his battle with fear, whatever the cost. To Anakin, the choice between Padme and the Jedi wasn't a choice at all. Once his shock and the last tattered remnants of his belief in the Jedi were gone, it was a simple matter for him to accept the title of Darth Vader. To Anakin, that name, that new identity, was a promise of victory over his fear. To quote the novelization, the Sith Lord, who once had been a Jedi hero called Anakin Skywalker, stood, drawing himself up to his full height. But he looked not outward upon his new master, nor upon the planet city beyond, nor out into the galaxy that he would soon rule. He instead turned his gaze inward. He unlocked the furnace gate within his heart and stepped forth to regard with new eyes the cold, freezing dread of the Dead Star Dragon that had haunted his life. "I am Darth Vader," he said within himself. The dragon tried again to whisper of failure and weakness and inevitable death, but with one hand, the Sith Lord caught it, crushed away its voice. Tried to rise then, to coil and rear and strike, but the Sith Lord laid his other hand upon it and broke its power with a single effortless twist. "I am Darth Vader," he repeated as he ground the dragon's corpse to dust between his mental heel, as he watched the dragon's dust and ashes scatter before the blast from his furnace heart. "And you are nothing at all." He had become, finally, what they all called him, the hero with no fear. Of course, that wasn't true, as we'll get to shortly. Furthermore, becoming Vader meant destroying his relationships with the people he cared about. It was easy for Vader to abandon the Jedi ways, and it wasn't much harder for him to turn against the Jedi Order. He didn't have attachments to most of the Jedi, and due to Palpatine's manipulations, he quickly started to see the Jedi as an enemy. The Jedi were a threat to Palpatine. They had tried to assassinate him after all. More importantly, they were a threat to Padme. From Vader's perspective, the Jedi sought to deny him the ability to save her life. Because of this, they became Vader's enemies, and because they became his enemies, they were subjected to the full force of Vader's anger and hate. It didn't matter that most of them had treated him well for the past 13 years, nor did it matter that many of them were younglings. To Vader, they had become evil, a threat to the people he loved, and that meant they deserved death. The slaughter of the younglings is something a lot of people see as a real heel turn moment for Anakin, but it was something he was always capable of. When it came to groups he saw as the enemy, any one member deserved death, period. This was why he slaughtered a whole tribe of sand people on Tatooine, and this logic drove his slaughter of the younglings as well. For Anakin, either you were with him or against him. As Obi-Wan pointed out, this was a Sith perspective, but it was one that Anakin had held all along. When Anakin became Vader, this absolutist mentality drove him rapidly down the path of the dark side. He slaughtered the Jedi, he slaughtered the Separatists, and then he turned on his loved ones too. Vader believed that the dark side would grant him the power to save his loved ones, but he quickly found that it instead destroyed his relationships with them. Palpatine manipulated him into believing that Obi-Wan had betrayed him. Then, when Vader became convinced that Padme was working with Obi-Wan, he believed that she had betrayed him as well. By the time he realized that Palpatine had been the one dogging him the whole time, Vader had destroyed all his relationships with the people he had done it all for. In doing so, he had destroyed himself. By the time Vader realized what he had done, it was too late. To pull one last passage from the novelization. Padme, are you here? Are you alright? I'm very sorry, Lord Vader. I'm afraid she died. It seems in your anger, you killed her. This burns hotter than the lava had. No, it's not possible. You loved her. You will always love her. You could never will her death. Never. But you remember all of it. You remember the dragon that you brought Vader forth from your heart to slay. You remember the cold venom in Vader's blood. You remember the furnace of Vader's fury and the black hatred of seizing her throat to silence her lying mouth. And there was one blazing moment in which you finally understand that there was no dragon, that there was no Vader. There was only you, only Anakin Skywalker. That it was all you, is you, only you. You did it. You killed her. You killed her because, finally, when you could have saved her, when you could have gone away with her, when you could have been thinking about her, you were thinking about yourself. It is in this blazing moment that you finally understand the trap of the dark side, the final cruelty of the Sith, because now yourself is all you will ever have. And you rage and scream and reach through the Force to crush the shadow who has destroyed you, but the power you can touch is only a memory, and so with all of your world-destroying fury, it is only droids around you that implode, and equipment, and the table on which you were strapped shatters, and in the end, you cannot touch the shadow. In the end, you do not even want to. In the end, the shadow is all you have left. Because the shadow understands you, the shadow forgives you, the shadow gathers you onto itself, and within your furnace heart, you burn in your own flame. This was the inevitable end of a fall to the dark side. Darksiders started out down the path of attachment, looking for power to save the ones they loved. But the cost of achieving that power drove all their loved ones away, leaving the dark side with nothing but an empty quest for more power. For Vader, his fall to the dark side destroyed everything he cared about, everything he'd been. He had done it all to save Padme, but as his lust for power and his fear and hatred of his enemies grew, he killed her. The dark side was a path of selfishness, and sooner or later, it destroyed all the relationships its users tried to maintain. Anakin saw becoming Darth Vader as a way of defeating his fear, becoming someone who could slay the Dead Star Dragon. In reality, Vader brought the dragon's prophecies to pass, taking away everyone Anakin cared about. But worst of all was Anakin's realization that it was all his fault, that he had never really become Vader at all. Vader was him. The name was different, but the person was the same. He had destroyed himself. This leads us back to something we mentioned in the beginning, the division between Anakin and Vader, or the lack thereof. The only difference between the two was what Vader had lost. Vader was Anakin with no one left to care about, nothing to keep living for except destroying his enemies. As we've said before, Anakin's transformation into Vader was just a dramatic expansion of the pool of beings he considered enemies. He was no different as a person. With that said, Vader maintained otherwise. He kept his true identity secret, and when confronted with it, he maintained that he was a different person and that he'd killed Anakin Skywalker. Of course, as the earlier novelization passage suggested, he knew that this wasn't true. It was an excuse he wanted to believe. It was easier for him to believe that he, Vader, was a monster that had killed the old Anakin, rather than to accept that he'd always been that monster and that he'd let himself do terrible things. As a Sith Lord, Vader was full of hate. He hated the Jedi, who he still believed had betrayed him, and he hated anyone opposed to the Empire, deeming these beings separatists and Jedi collaborators. The politics of it never really mattered to him. He still held no principles beyond a vague sense of justice. By that point, of course, his idea of justice was warped. It was no longer about protecting the ones he loved, because he didn't have anyone to love anymore. Rather, justice to Vader meant the destruction of his enemies. Truthfully, that was always part of how he had seen justice anyway. More than any of his enemies though, Vader hated himself. While he'd never admit it, he knew deep down that everything that had happened to him was his fault. He understood how his choices led him to ruin, and he despised himself for making them. This, not his barbecuing on Mustafar, was what made Vader less powerful than he'd been during the Clone Wars. For a Sith, anger and hatred were powerful tools. By manipulating Vader into destroying all his relationships and leaving him with nothing but hate, Sidious hoped Vader would become the most powerful student the dark side had ever had. Though, while hating other people is conducive to the dark side, hating yourself is not. If you hate yourself, then it diminishes your capacity for selfishness in a way, which is the root of the dark side. Vader was obviously still a Darksider, but he was weaker for his self-loathing. During the reign of the Empire, Vader was mostly driven by inertia. As we mentioned earlier, Anakin wasn't just extremely attached to his loved ones, he also relied on their approval. Without anyone to care about, Vader lost most of his motivation. Like any Sith Lord, he constantly sought greater power, but just as he had never really been a good Jedi, he was never really that strong of a Sith either. Unlike his master, he didn't feel drawn to power for power's sake, nor did he take pleasure in cruelty. Vader sought greater power only because he wanted to destroy his enemies, the Emperor most of all. If he had been successful, he would have been completely bereft of motivation. Darth Vader was a shell of a man, a creature of hate without reason. Vader was aware of the miserable nature of his existence, but for decades, he made no attempt to change it or atone for his sins. This was because Vader believed he was irredeemable. The Jedi of his time believed that Sith Lords could never truly be redeemed after all, and Vader reasoned that, since he couldn't even forgive himself, there was no way he could ever atone and be forgiven by others. As he saw it, there was no other path for him but the way of the Sith. He kept going not because he wanted to, but because he didn't think he could go back. This, alongside Vader's hatred of his enemies, was why he became so cruel. He saw himself as a monster and believed he had no choice but to be a monster, so he acted like one. He saw himself as Darth Vader, who had murdered Padme and Anakin Skywalker, even though he knew full well that he was still Skywalker. He rejected the idea of trying to become a better person because, in his mind, that wasn't something Darth Vader was capable of. His excuses became a delusion which trapped him on the path of atrocity. Then Luke came along. At first, Vader only saw Luke as a key to victory, a way to defeat the Emperor and take revenge on all of his enemies. He wanted to train Luke as a Sith apprentice, but Luke, of course, refused. To Vader's disappointment, Luke remained loyal to the Jedi. However, Vader kept trying to turn him. It wasn't just because Luke was powerful, but because Luke was his son, or rather, because he was Padme's son. Luke, to Vader, was a part of Padme in a sense, and perhaps the only thing he hadn't lost. After his first encounter with Luke, he became committed to protecting him, though at first, he didn't really understand why. That was why Vader kept pressuring Luke to turn to the dark side. He believed it was the only way he could protect him from Sidious. Vader, by that point, believed Sidious was pretty much unstoppable. Everything happened as he foresaw, and his power was far beyond Vader's. Destiny was on the Emperor's side. This was why Vader hesitated to move against him, even when Luke offered himself up to Vader during the Battle of Endor. During the Battle of Endor, Vader kept trying to turn Luke to the dark side, only to be taken aback as Luke tried to redeem him instead. Despite everything Vader said or did, Luke was adamant that there was still good in him and refused to kill him at every turn. But Luke also rejected the dark side. Even after his battle with Vader in the Emperor's throne room, Luke continued to defy Sidious, affirming that he was a Jedi like his father before him. It's important to note here that this ran counter to what Sidious had foreseen. That alone had a massive impact on Vader. He had seen Sidious as infallible and believed destiny was set in stone. It was his destiny to be Vader, Sidious's destiny to rule, and Luke's destiny to follow in his father's footsteps. But Luke rejected his destiny, proving it wasn't set in stone. If Luke could reject fate and defy the Emperor, then so could Vader. But it was also immensely impactful that Luke not only affirmed his loyalties to the Jedi, but affirmed that Vader was still a Jedi as well. Despite everything Vader had done, despite threatening Luke's sister, Luke still saw him as a Jedi at heart. That was all Vader needed to cast aside the delusions he'd built around him. In that moment, He accepted what he had realized decades ago, that he was and had always been Anakin Skywalker. As much as he had been Vader, he had always been the hero of the Clone Wars and a Jedi. And if Luke could choose to reject the darkness, to reject fate, to be a Jedi like his father, then his father could choose to be a Jedi like his son. Darth Vader was never truly loyal to the Empire or the Sith. As Obi-Wan once said, he was loyal to people, not principles. Aboard the second Death Star, he realized he still loved his son in spite of how far he'd fallen, and he immediately knew where his loyalties lay. As much as he had been willing to abandon the Jedi for the sake of Padme, Anakin Skywalker abandoned the Sith for the sake of Luke and his own life in the process. Unlike with Padme, however, when Anakin slew Sidious, it truly was for Luke's sake, not for himself. It was a final act of selflessness, and in that moment, he returned to the light, becoming one with the Force. Luke Skywalker was the hero we'd all like to see ourselves as, the one who makes the right choices and saves the day. But more often than not, Anakin Skywalker is who we are. From his trauma to his battles with fear to his cataclysmic mistakes, he's perhaps the most human character in Star Wars. Most importantly though, he's a reminder that no matter how far you fall, no matter how badly you fail, your future is not set in stone. You can always try to make amends. But what do you think? What are your thoughts on Anakin Skywalker? Remember to go buy the Revenge of the Sith novelization, and feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.